morning sun was barely peeking through the tall windows of Grand Central Terminal when David Rodriguez stepped off the subway platform. Anyone looking at him would see just another tired commuter, worn blue jeans with a small hole near the knee, a faded gray jacket that had seen better days, and sneakers that definitely weren't designer. His dark hair was a bit messy, and he carried nothing more than a simple black backpack over his shoulder. But appearances can be deceiving. David wasn't heading to work like everyone else rushing around him. He owned the work. His tech company had just hit the $2 billion mark last month, making him one of the youngest billionaires in the country. Yet here he was, looking like he might be searching for loose change in his pockets. The board meeting 3 hours earlier had left him feeling drained. 12 men and women in expensive suits had spent 2 hours questioning every decision he'd made in the past year. "Why are you giving away so much money?" they'd asked. "The shareholders want profits, not charity." Their words still echoed in his head as he walked through the busy terminal. David had always been different from other wealthy people. While his business friends bought third vacation homes and private jets, he lived in a modest apartment and took the subway. He remembered what it was like to struggle, to count every dollar, to wonder if you'd make rent that month. His success hadn't made him forget where he came from. The terminal was getting busier as the morning rush hour picked up. People moved, like they were in a race, checking phones, gulping coffee, and barely looking at each other. Everyone had somewhere important to be, someone waiting for them, deadlines to meet. David envied them in a way. Their problems seemed so clear, so simple compared to his. That's when he saw it. Sitting there in the middle of all the chaos was an old, upright piano. It looked lonely, almost forgotten, with its dark wood finish, that had probably been beautiful once upon a time. The bench in front of it was empty, which was unusual for this time of day. Usually someone would be playing, sometimes good, sometimes not so good, but always drawing a small crowd. David stopped, walking. Something about that piano called to him. It reminded him of another piano, in another time, in another life. His feet seemed to move on their own, carrying him closer to the instrument. 30 years ago, David had been a different person with a different dream. Back then, he was Danny Rodriguez, an 8-year-old kid whose mom cleaned office buildings at night to pay the bills. Their apartment was tiny, cramped, and the neighbors were often loud. But in their living room sat an old piano that his mother had bought from a yard sale for $50. "Music is magic, mijo," she used to tell him in her gentle voice, mixing English with Spanish the way she always did. "When you play, you can go anywhere, be anything." She had learned to play as a child in Mexico, before life got complicated, before she had to work 3 jobs just to survive. Every evening after school, while his mom slept before her night shift, David would sit at that piano. His small fingers would find the keys, and he'd play the songs she taught him. Classical pieces mostly, Chopin, Mozart, Beethoven. His mother said these composers knew how to speak to the heart. David was good, really good. His music teacher at school said he had a gift, that he could maybe get a scholarship to a music school. For a few years, that's all he dreamed about. He imagined himself on stage, playing in front of hundreds of people, making his mother proud. But dreams and reality don't always match up. When David turned 16, his mother got sick. The medical bills piled up like mountains. College became a luxury they couldn't afford, let alone music school. David put away his dreams and focused on more practical things. He taught himself computer programming, started a small business fixing computers, and slowly built something bigger. The business grew and grew. One day he woke up and realized he was rich. Really rich, but his mother wasn't there to see it. She had passed away 5 years ago, still believing her son would someday play piano on a big stage. Now, standing in front of this public piano in Grand Central, David felt like that 8-year-old boy again. His hands, which now signed $1-million contracts and typed on expensive laptops, remembered what it felt like to make music. A businessman rushed past, bumping David's shoulder and muttering an apology without stopping. The collision snapped David back to the present moment. He looked around at all the people hurrying by, each lost in their own world of problems and deadlines. When was the last time he had played? Really played, not just pressed a few keys while walking past a piano in a hotel lobby. When was the last time he had sat down and let music pour out of him the way it used to? David approached the piano bench slowly. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. The piano doesn't care if you're rich or poor, mijo. It only cares if you play with your heart. He set his backpack down beside the bench and sat down carefully. The seat was worn smooth by thousands of other people who had sat here before him. Street musicians, music students, maybe even other people carrying secrets they couldn't share. The keys looked the same as they always had. Black and white, simple and honest. David placed his hands on them gently, feeling their familiar texture under his fingertips. They were slightly cool to the touch, waiting patiently for someone to bring them to life. A few people glanced his way as they passed, probably wondering if they were about to hear something beautiful or something that would make them walk faster. David didn't notice them. For the first time in months, maybe years, his mind was quiet. He thought about his mother, about the way she used to hum while she cooked dinner, about how her face would light up when he played her favorite songs. He thought about the boy he used to be, full of dreams and music before life taught him that sometimes you have to choose between what you love and what you need. The terminal continued to buzz with activity around him. Trains arrived and departed. Announcements echoed from the speakers, and hundreds of conversations created a constant hum of human noise. But David heard none of it. In his mind, he was back in that tiny apartment, sitting next to his mother, on the piano bench, her patient hands guiding his small fingers to the right keys. "Play what your heart tells you," she used to say. "Don't think so much. Just feel." David took a deep breath and let his fingers find their first chord. He didn't think about the board meeting, or the business deals waiting for him, or the people who might be watching. He just remembered what it felt like to be 8 years old and completely in love with music. The first note that came from the piano was soft, almost hesitant, but it was clean and pure, carrying with it 30 years of silence that was finally ready to be broken. David's fingers pressed down on the keys, and the first few notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the air around him. The melody was soft at first, almost like a whisper that only he could hear. But as his confidence grew, the music became stronger, more sure of itself. He had chosen this piece without even thinking about it. It was the first real song his mother had taught him when he was 12 years old. "This one is special, mijo," she had said, sitting beside him on their old piano bench. Chopin wrote this when he was homesick, missing his country. Music can carry feelings that words can't hold. Now, 23 years later, David understood what she meant. Each note seemed to carry a piece of his heart with it, floating out into the busy terminal like invisible messages to anyone who would listen. At first, nobody seemed to notice. People kept walking past, focused on their phones, their coffee, their hurried conversations. The morning rush was in full swing, and everyone had somewhere important to be. David didn't mind. In fact, he preferred it this way. He wasn't playing, for them anyway. He was playing for himself, for his mother, for the boy he used to be. But music has a way of sneaking up on people when they least expect it. Lisa Chen was rushing to catch the 8:47 train to White Plains when she heard the first few bars of the Nocturne. She almost didn't stop. She was already running late for work, and her boss had been particularly cranky lately about punctuality. But something about those notes made her feet slow down, then stop completely. She recognized the piece immediately. Her grandmother used to play it on an old piano in their house in Chinatown, back when Lisa was just a little girl. Grandma Chen had learned it in China before the war, before she came to America with nothing but a suitcase and a head full of dreams. Lisa hadn't heard that song in over 10 years, not since her grandmother passed away. Now, standing 20 feet away from this stranger at the piano, Lisa felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. The way he played it was different from her grandmother's version, but somehow it carried the same sadness, the same longing for something lost. She pulled out her phone to check the time, then put it away again. The train could wait 5 minutes. On the other side of the piano, Tom Bradley was having the worst morning of his 68-year life. He'd just come from the doctor's office, where he'd received news that no one ever wants to hear. The words, Stage 3, kept echoing in his head as he walked through the terminal, trying to figure out how he was going to tell his wife of 42 years that their retirement plans needed to change. Tom had been so lost in his worried thoughts that he almost walked right past the piano, but then the music reached him, and something inside his chest seemed to crack open. This song. He knew this song. His late mother used to hum it while she did the dishes, back when he was just a kid growing up in Brooklyn. He set his briefcase down on the floor and stood there, letting the melody wash over him. For the first time all morning, his mind wasn't focused on test results and treatment options. Instead, he was remembering his mother's gentle humming, the way she'd ruffle his hair when he helped dry the dishes, the way she'd kiss his forehead and tell him everything would be okay. Maybe, Tom thought, everything would be okay. Maybe not in the way he'd planned, but okay in some other way he couldn't see yet. David was completely unaware of the small crowd that was beginning to form around him. His eyes were closed now, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm of the music. His fingers moved across the keys like they had a memory of their own, finding notes and chords that he hadn't played in years but somehow still knew by heart. The terminal's acoustics were better than he'd expected. The high ceilings and marble floors carried the sound beautifully, turning his simple piano into something that felt almost like a concert hall. Each note seemed to bounce off the walls and come back stronger, richer, more alive. Rachel Martinez was trying to calm her crying baby when the music started. Little Sophia had been fussy all morning, and Rachel was feeling frustrated and embarrassed, as other commuters gave them annoyed looks. She'd been bouncing Sophia and shushing her for 20 minutes, but nothing seemed to work. Then the piano music began, and something magical happened. Sophia's crying gradually quieted to sniffles, then to silence. The baby's big brown eyes grew wide as she listened to the melody, her tiny fist unclenching from Rachel's shirt. For the first time all morning, Sophia seemed peaceful. Rachel found herself swaying gently to the music, holding her daughter close. She didn't recognize the classical piece, but she didn't need to. She could feel its beauty, its sadness, its hope all mixed together. Sophia gurgled softly, as if she were trying to sing along. "You like that, don't you, baby?" Rachel whispered, kissing the top of Sophia's head. Music makes everything better. More people were stopping now. A college student with paint-stained fingers paused on her way to art class. A construction worker in a hard hat stood respectfully at the edge of the growing circle. A businessman loosened his tie as he listened, his morning stress melting away with each phrase of the nocturne. David was reaching the most beautiful part of the piece now, the section where Chopin's melody seemed to float like a bird taking flight. His left hand provided a gentle, steady rhythm while his right hand danced across the higher keys, creating a conversation between different voices in the music. This was the part his mother had loved most. "Listen to how it sings, mijo," she used to say. "The piano is singing to us." She would close her eyes when he played this section, a small smile on her face as if she were listening to angels. The crowd around the piano had grown to about 30 people now, but they were all keeping a respectful distance. There was something sacred happening here, something too precious to interrupt. Even the usually noisy terminal seemed quieter, as if the whole building was holding its breath to listen. David's playing was flawless, but it was more than just technical skill. He was pouring his soul into every note, sharing pieces of himself that he'd kept locked away for years. The music carried his memories of late nights practicing while his mother slept, of her proud smile when he mastered a difficult passage, of the dreams they'd shared before life got complicated. A teenage boy who'd been skateboarding through the terminal stopped and tucked his board under his arm. He'd never been interested in classical music before. It always seemed boring and old-fashioned. But this was different. This felt alive, real, like the piano player was telling a story that everyone could understand, even without words. The boy found himself thinking about his own grandmother, who lived in Puerto Rico and whom he hadn't seen in 2 years. She used to sing old songs while she cooked, filling their house with music and the smell of sofrito. Maybe he should call her today, he thought. Maybe he should tell her he missed her singing. David was nearing the end of the first piece now, but his fingers showed no signs of stopping. The music had awakened something in him that had been sleeping for too long. He could feel his mother's presence somehow, as if she were sitting right there beside him on the piano bench, nodding with approval. The nocturne's final notes hung, in the air like morning mist, beautiful and fragile. But instead of silence, David's hands found new keys, new chords, the beginning of another song that his heart needed to play. Without missing a beat, David's fingers found the opening notes of Clair de Lune by Debussy. The transition was so smooth that many people in the crowd didn't even realize he'd started a new piece. But this song was different. Where the Chopin had been gentle and nostalgic, this music felt deeper, more personal, like he was opening a door to the most private parts of his heart. This had been his mother's absolute favorite piece. Every Sunday morning, she would ask him to play it while she made breakfast. "Play the moon song, mijo," she would say with that special smile she saved just for him. "It makes the whole house feel peaceful." Now, as his fingers moved across the keys, David could almost smell her coffee brewing in their tiny kitchen. He could picture her standing at the stove, humming along softly while she flipped pancakes, her whole body swaying to the rhythm of the music. Those Sunday mornings had been perfect, just the two of them in their own little world. But this wasn't just any performance of Clair de Lune. This was the song David had played for his mother in the hospital 5 years ago, on the day she died. The memory hit him like a wave. He'd brought a small keyboard to her room, even though the nurses said she probably couldn't hear him anymore. Her breathing was so shallow, so fragile, and the machines around her bed beeped softly in the background. But David had played anyway, his fingers finding the familiar melody while tears streamed down his face. "I'm sorry I didn't become a musician, Mama," he had whispered between the notes. "I'm sorry I chose money over music. I'm sorry I wasn't the son you wanted me to be." She had died while he was playing the final measures of the song, her hand still warm in his. The doctors said it was a peaceful passing, that she probably felt no pain, but David had carried the guilt for 5 years, wondering if she'd been disappointed in the choices he'd made. Now, sitting at this public piano in Grand Central Terminal, all of those feelings came flooding back. His playing became more intense, more emotional, as if he were having a conversation with her spirit. Each phrase of the music carried an apology, a declaration of love, a promise that he'd never forgotten the lessons she'd taught him. The crowd around him had grown to over 100 people now. Word was spreading through the terminal in whispers and text messages. "There's this guy playing piano," people were telling their friends. "You have to hear this. It's incredible." But incredible didn't really describe what was happening. This was something beyond skillful playing. This was a man pouring his entire soul into music, and everyone who heard it could feel the raw emotion in every note. Jennifer Walsh was on her phone with her insurance company, arguing about a claim that had been denied when she heard the music. She was stressed, frustrated, and running late for a job interview that could change her life. But something about the piano made her hang up mid-sentence. She pushed through the crowd until she could see the pianist clearly. He was completely absorbed in his playing, his eyes closed, his whole body moving with the music. Jennifer had taken piano lessons as a child, so she knew this piece. But she'd never heard it played like this before. It was like the man was bleeding. Music, like every note, was costing him something. Tears started running down her face before she even realized she was crying. She thought about her own mother, who had died 3 years ago from cancer. She thought about all the conversations they'd never had, all the time she'd been too busy to call, too focused on her own problems to really listen. The music seemed to understand her regret, her sadness, her love for someone who was gone forever. It was like the pianist knew exactly what she was feeling and was putting it into sound. Carlos Mendoza had been working construction for 20 years, and he'd never considered himself a sensitive guy. He was tough, practical, the kind of man who fixed problems with his hands and didn't waste time on fancy things like classical music. But something about this piano playing stopped him cold. He removed his hard hat and held it against his chest as he listened. The music reminded him of his daughter, who had been taking piano lessons before she died in a car accident 8 years ago. She used to play songs like this, filling their house with beautiful melodies that made even the roughest day feel better. Carlos hadn't listened to piano music since the accident. It hurt too much, brought back too many memories of her small hands on the keys, her concentrated face as she worked through difficult passages. But now, hearing this stranger play with such passion and skill, he felt something shift inside his chest. Maybe it was okay to remember her music. Maybe it was okay to let himself feel that beauty again, even if it came with sadness. The teenage girl who had pulled out her phone earlier was now recording everything. Her name was Zoe, and she had over 50,000 followers on social media. She'd started recording because she thought it might make a good post. Random guy playing piano in train station. But now she realized she was witnessing something much more important. Through her phone screen, she could see the pianist's face clearly. He was crying now, tears streaming down his cheeks as he played. But he wasn't embarrassed or trying to hide it. He was completely lost in the music, completely vulnerable in front of all these strangers. Zoe had never seen anything like it. In her world of carefully curated posts and perfect images, this raw honesty was shocking. This man was showing his heart to everyone, holding nothing back, letting the music carry his deepest feelings. She kept recording, but now it wasn't for her followers. It was because she knew she was witnessing something rare and precious, something that might change people's lives. David was reaching the most beautiful part of Clair de Lune now, the section where the melody seems to float like moonlight on water. His mother used to say this part made her think of angels dancing. She would close her eyes and smile as if she could actually see them. The crowd was completely silent now, even the people who had just arrived and didn't know what was happening. There was something in the air, an energy that made everyone understand. They were part of something special. Businessmen stood next to construction workers, teenagers next to elderly couples, all of them united by the music flowing from the piano. David's left hand provided a gentle, rolling accompaniment, while his right hand sang the melody with a sweetness that made hearts ache. This was the section he'd been playing when his mother took her last breath, and now he played it like a lullaby, like a final goodbye, like a promise that he would never forget her love. The music filled every corner of the terminal, bouncing off the high ceiling and marble walls, creating a cathedral of sound. People on the upper level had stopped to listen, leaning over the railings to see what was happening below. Even the busy commuters rushing to catch trains found themselves slowing down, drawn by the beauty of the moment. As David played, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. For the first time since his mother's death, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The music was healing something inside him that had been broken for too long. The final measures of Clair de Lune approached, and David played them with a tenderness that made the entire crowd hold their breath. These were the last notes his mother had heard, and he played them like a prayer, like a love letter, like a son's promise to always remember the woman who had given him the gift of music. As David played the final delicate notes of Clair de Lune, something inside him completely broke open. The last soft chord hung in the air like a whisper, and suddenly he couldn't hold back the flood of emotions that had been building up for 5 long years. His shoulders began to shake. Tears that he'd been holding back streamed freely down his face, dropping onto the piano keys below. The music had cracked open a dam in his heart, and now everything came pouring out. The guilt, the regret, the overwhelming love for a woman who would never hear him play again. "I'm sorry, Mama," he whispered, his voice barely audible but, somehow, carrying in the perfect acoustics of the terminal. "I'm so sorry I chose everything else over you. I'm sorry I missed so many Sunday mornings. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me most." The crowd of over 200 people who had gathered around the piano stood in complete silence. Many of them were crying too, not just because of David's obvious pain, but because his raw honesty had touched something deep inside each of them. In a world where everyone wore masks and pretended everything was fine, here was a man showing his broken heart to complete strangers. Patricia Williams, a nurse who had been working night shifts for 15 years, recognized the kind of grief David was experiencing. She'd seen it countless times in hospital rooms, the guilt that children carry when they lose a parent. The way David was apologizing to his mother reminded her of her own father, who had died 10 years ago while she was working a double shift. She wanted to go to David, to tell him that mothers understand, that his mama knew he loved her even when life pulled him in different directions. But she stayed where she was, respecting the sacred space that had formed around the piano. In the crowd, an elderly gentleman named Frank noticed something that others had missed. He'd been a classical music professor for 40 years before retiring, and he recognized not just the incredible skill of the pianist, but something familiar about his playing style. The way David's fingers moved, the particular phrasing he used, the emotional depth of his interpretation. It reminded Frank of someone he'd known years ago. Frank pulled out his phone and started Googling quietly. Elena Rodriguez, piano teacher, he typed, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. Elena had been a colleague of his at a music school in the Bronx, a brilliant pianist who had given up her performing career to raise her son and teach children. She talked about her boy constantly, how talented he was, how proud she was of his musical gifts. When Frank found Elena's obituary from 5 years ago, his suspicions were confirmed. The photo showed a warm, smiling woman, and the article mentioned that she was survived by her son David, a successful businessman. Frank's eyes widened as he looked from his phone screen to the man at the piano. Could this really be Elena's son? The same David she'd spoken about with such love and pride? Frank had always wondered what happened to Elena's musical prodigy. She'd shown him videos of David playing when he was young, and Frank had never forgotten the boy's exceptional talent. Elena had been heartbroken when David stopped playing to focus on his career, but she'd understood. He has to make his own path, she told Frank, but I know the music will call him back someday. Now, watching David pour his soul into the piano, Frank realized that someday had arrived. The teenager with the phone, Zoe, was still recording, but now she was crying so hard she could barely hold her device steady. She'd started this recording thinking it would be a fun post for her social media. But now she understood she was capturing something much more important. This wasn't just a random guy playing piano. This was a man having a conversation with his dead mother, using music as his language. Her own relationship with her mother was complicated. They fought constantly about everything: clothes, grades, friends, curfew. Zoe often felt like her mom didn't understand her, like they spoke completely different languages. But watching David's raw grief made her think about what would happen if her mother wasn't there anymore. What if all those fights were the last conversations they ever had? She made a mental note to hug her mom when she got home, to maybe apologize for some of the harsh words she'd said that morning before leaving for school. David's hands were still resting on the piano keys, but now he was speaking softly to himself, having a conversation that the crowd could barely hear but somehow understood perfectly. "I know you wanted me to keep playing, Mama," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know you were disappointed when I stopped, but I thought I had to choose. I thought I couldn't have both, the music and the success. I thought I had to be practical, had to make money, had to prove I could take care of you." He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "But you never needed me to be rich, did you? You just needed me to be happy. You just wanted me to keep the music alive." A construction worker in the crowd, Rico Morales, felt his throat tighten as he listened. He'd been pushing his own teenage son to focus on sports and grades, discouraging the boy's interest in art because it wasn't practical. Rico's father had done the same thing to him when he'd wanted to learn guitar, and now Rico was repeating the pattern. Watching this man grieve for the music he'd given up made Rico realize he might be making a terrible mistake. Maybe there was room in life for both dreams and security. Maybe pushing his son away from art wasn't protecting him. Maybe it was stealing something precious from him. Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychiatrist who happened to be passing through the terminal, recognized what she was witnessing as a profound moment of healing. David was doing something that most people never allow themselves to do. He was grieving publicly, authentically, without shame. He was letting himself feel the full weight of his loss, instead of pushing it down or hiding it behind a mask of success. In her years of practice, Dr. Foster had seen how destructive unexpressed grief could be. People carried it like a poison in their hearts, letting it slowly destroy their ability to connect, to love, to feel joy. But David was choosing differently. He was letting his grief transform into something beautiful, something that could touch other people's hearts and maybe help them heal too. The crowd continued to grow as word spread through the terminal. People were texting friends, calling family, members posting on social media. "You have to get down to Grand Central," they were saying. "There's something happening here that you need to see." But it wasn't just curiosity drawing people in. It was the recognition that in a world full of fake interactions and surface-level connections, they were witnessing something real. David's vulnerability was giving everyone else permission to feel their own hidden emotions, to remember their own losses, to connect with the parts of themselves they usually kept locked away. A young mother named Keiko held her sleeping baby closer as she watched David cry. She thought about her own mother in Japan, who she hadn't spoken to in 2 years because of a silly argument about her marriage. Watching David's regret made her realize how precious and fragile family relationships really were. She pulled out her phone not to record the scene, but to send a message to her mother. "I miss you," she typed in Japanese. "I love you. Can we talk?" David finally lifted his head and looked out at the sea of faces surrounding him. For the first time, he seemed to truly see the crowd that had gathered. There were hundreds of people, now all watching him with compassion and understanding. No one looked embarrassed by his tears or uncomfortable with his raw emotion. Instead, many of them were crying too, each person connected to his grief through their own experiences of loss and love. David looked out at the hundreds of faces surrounding him and something shifted in his heart. These weren't strangers anymore. They had shared something sacred with him, witnessed his most vulnerable moment, and somehow made him feel less alone than he'd felt in years. He could see his own pain reflected in many of their eyes, and he realized that grief was something that connected all human beings, no matter who they were or where they came from. He took a deep breath and placed his hands back on the piano keys, but this time he didn't play a famous classical piece. Instead, his fingers found a simple melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside his soul. It was a song he'd never played before, never even heard before, but somehow his hands knew exactly what to do. The melody was gentle and sweet, like a lullaby that a mother might hum to her child before bedtime. It was the kind of song that made you think of safety, warmth, and unconditional love. As David played, he realized this was the song his mother used to hum when he was very small, too young to remember the words, but old enough to remember how it made him feel. "This is for you, Mama," he whispered as his fingers danced across the keys. "This is the song you used to sing when you thought I was sleeping." The crowd listened in complete silence as David's improvised lullaby filled the terminal. It was simpler than the classical pieces he'd played before, but somehow it felt more personal, more honest. This was David's own music, coming straight from his heart to theirs. In the audience, Frank the music professor wiped tears from his eyes. He remembered Elena telling him about this exact lullaby years ago. She'd said it was a song her own mother had sung to her in Mexico, and that she'd passed it down to David when he was a baby. Hearing it now, Frank felt like Elena's spirit was somehow present in the terminal, watching her son finally come home to the music she'd given him. As David played, something beautiful began to happen. People in the crowd started to sway gently with the melody. A few began to hum along softly, even though they'd never heard the song before. The tune was so simple, so universal that it felt familiar to everyone. Baby Sophia, who had been sleeping peacefully in her mother Rachel's arms since the beginning of David's performance, opened her eyes and gurgled softly, as if she were trying to sing along. Rachel smiled through her tears, amazed that her daughter seemed to understand the beauty of what was happening around them. The teenager Zoe had stopped recording now. She realized that some moments were too precious to view through a screen. Instead, she just stood there, letting the music wash over her, feeling connected to every person in the crowd and to the pianist who had opened his heart so completely. As the lullaby came to a gentle end, David played the final notes slowly, letting each one linger in the air. When the last sound faded away, the entire terminal fell into a profound silence. It wasn't an awkward quiet. It was the kind of peaceful stillness that follows something truly beautiful. Then, after what felt like forever but was probably only 30 seconds, someone started clapping. It wasn't the loud, enthusiastic applause you'd hear at a concert. Instead, it was soft, respectful, like the gentle rain on a summer evening. Soon everyone was clapping, but in the same gentle way, as if they understood that what they'd witnessed was too sacred for anything louder. David stood up from the piano bench slowly, his legs shaky after sitting for so long. He looked out at the sea of faces one more time, nodding his gratitude to each section of the crowd. He couldn't speak, his throat was too tight with emotion, but his eyes said everything that words couldn't. He picked up his simple black backpack from beside the piano bench and started to walk away. The crowd parted respectfully, creating a path for him. But as he passed, people reached out to touch his shoulder gently, to whisper, "Thank you," or "That was beautiful," or simply to nod their understanding. A middle-aged woman pressed a tissue into his hand. A construction worker saluted him respectfully. An elderly couple smiled at him like proud grandparents. Each small gesture felt like a blessing, like the entire crowd was sending him love and support for his journey ahead. Frank, the music professor, watched David walk away, and something told him this wasn't the end of the story. Elena's son had rediscovered his gift, and Frank had a feeling the world would be hearing more from him soon. David made it halfway across the terminal before he had to stop, not because his legs were tired, but because he realized something important. All these years he'd thought his mother would have been disappointed in his choices. He'd carried that guilt like a heavy stone in his chest, believing that he'd let her down by choosing business over music. But now he understood the truth. His mother hadn't wanted him to be a struggling musician. She'd wanted him to be happy, successful, and true to himself. She'd wanted him to use his gifts, all of his gifts, to make the world a better place. Standing there in Grand Central Terminal, David made a decision that would change everything. Within 6 months, the video that Zoe had recorded would be viewed by millions of people around the world. But that wasn't the most important thing that happened. The most important thing was what David did next. He used his business success and his rediscovered love of music to create something his mother would have been truly proud of. He started a foundation that provided free music lessons to children whose families couldn't afford them. He opened music schools in low-income neighborhoods. He created scholarship programs for talented young musicians who needed help getting to college. But most importantly, he started playing again. Not just for himself, but for anyone who needed to hear music that came straight from the heart. The public piano at Grand Central Terminal became famous after that day. Musicians from around the world came to play on the same keys David had touched. People brought their own stories of loss and hope to that bench, sharing their hearts through music just like David had done. The terminal authorities eventually put up a small plaque near the piano. It didn't mention David's name or what had happened that day. Instead, it simply read, "Music speaks what cannot be expressed, soothes the mind and gives it rest, heals the heart and makes it whole, flows from heaven to the soul." But perhaps the most beautiful part of the whole story happened 2 years later. A young girl named Isabella, whose grandmother had been in the crowd that day at Grand Central, started taking piano lessons through David's foundation. She was talented, passionate, and reminded everyone of a young boy who had once dreamed of playing on big stages. On her 10th birthday, Isabella played Clair de Lune at her recital. In the audience, David sat next to the girl's grandmother, both of them crying happy tears as they listened to the music that connected them all. After the performance, Isabella ran up to David with a huge smile. "Did you hear me play your mama's favorite song?" she asked excitedly. David knelt down to her level and smiled. "I heard it," he said softly, "and I know she heard it too." The music had come full circle, just like his mother always said it would. And somewhere David knew, Elena Rodriguez was humming along, proud of the son who had finally found his way back home.